produce a different hormone.
Right.
But we know that estrogen and progesterone are very similar in structure, so it's easy to make that transition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? Let me think. Estrogen. What does estrogen do in the female? I mean, it does more than one thing, but what does it do in the female? No, maternal behavior.
Sexual behavior.
Okay, receptivity, right?
Yeah.
So estrogen is affecting the brain. What else do we say estrogen does in the female?
It also physically kind of changes the way that they look.
Okay, that secondary sex characteristics, that sexual dimorphism stuff. We talk about calcium metabolism, right? What about, and probably the one thing that was most important relative to going forward, and I said to put a little star by it, what do we know estrogen does relative to its effect on the hypothalamus? It has a positive feedback on the hypothalamus to cause the hypothalamus to produce more GnRH. Okay. And one more time, I'm going to revisit this, and then we'll move on. If this is a graph, which it obviously is, and this is time, and we're going to put two different things on here. My little circles. What are my little circles? Doing it faster so they're not quite as cute. Okay. So that's that antral follicle, right? So that's folliculogenesis. If I were to graph correspondingly FSH levels, what would that look like? Similar, right? So that's FSH. So what about estrogen? Very simple. Why? Because FSH is fed in granulosa cells, more granulosa cells, more estrogen. Now, again, not wanting to jump too far ahead, but what about this whole LH thing? We've established some information about LH. So where are we at here? We've got a mature follicle, okay? Once the follicle reaches maturity, do we need this guy anymore? Why not? It can't grow anymore, right? So we don't need any more folliculogenesis. What needs to come into play now? Because it is now mature. So what's the next step for this follicle? If it's mature, what's the next step? What's that called?
Ovulation.
Ovulation. And what do we say initiates ovulation? LH. So LH is going to come into play towards the end of folliculogenesis. We'll get into this more, but what does LH actually look like relative to this graph and being here? Is it going to be a progressive increase? Well, it could be, and it probably would be, but that's not the key there. Because it might look like that. We'll make this LH, okay? It may look like that, but it's so low level, it's not really having an effect. But it is going up a little bit. But that's not the point. What is going to trigger ovulation to start? Well, I said LH, but LH specifically the way it works. And it's called a surge in LH. What's going to happen is towards the end of folliculogenesis, and we'll get into how this all works a little bit later, but we're going to see a surge. That's a surge, okay? We're going to see a surge in LH. That surge is what triggers ovulation to start, okay? Now, going back to estrogen effect on the hypothalamus, what did I just say a few minutes ago about its effect on the hypothalamus?
Positive feedback.
Positive feedback. How does LH surge like that? Because estrogen reaches a certain level that's high enough to trigger the hypothalamus to cause a quick release of GnRH and a quick release of LH. And that then stimulates ovulation. Now, a lot of you are like, don't worry. We're coming back to this in great detail. I'm just kind of setting some foundation right now. But what did we say a little bit last time about this timing effect here? We've got a growing follicle. We've got estrogen levels going up. Why? Why is estrogen level? Why does that? It all works perfect. Reproduction is always a great, perfect thing, right? Why does estrogen levels go up at the same time the follicle is getting bigger? That's right, but what's the timing thing?
You need to have a mature follicle for ovulation to matter.
That's true. But what if estrogen levels were really low and you had follicle growth?
She wouldn't display the behavior, so she wouldn't be receptive.
That couldn't actually, estrogen couldn't happen, but if it were to happen, well, she wouldn't be receptive. So we've got to match her receptivity, her desire to mate, a male mating with her, with a mature follicle, because we're trying to time the sperm cells reaching the ovum at the same time. That's why it works nicely. The estrogen levels go up, sexual receptivity is increasing, at the same time we're maturing a follicle, and then of course we'd ovulate. And all that works kind of together, we hope, where we can have a sperm cells combined with an ovum. One thing I forgot before just as a reminder, we're going to finish up hormones today. I haven't decided yet what I want to cover, so I posted both of them. In your ND2L, I posted slides for puberty, slide 3, puberty and sexual maturation. And also down below in the lab section, I posted some slides on anatomy. So I don't know which, so bring both next time, because I can't decide on what I want to do. I think I want to do some anatomy stuff. Even though I don't have stuff for you to dissect yet, I think I might look at some diagrams to set some anatomy stuff, a foundation. And then we'll get into puberty later on. Okay, so let's finish up these hormone slides. I apologize ahead of time for some of these pictures in my slides. They might have been some of these. Okay, or I don't care if they're pictures or not. Okay, so last time we left off on this particular slide, if it ever comes up, we were talking about FSH. And we said, back to the male, by the way, FSH causes folliculogenesis in the female. What does FSH do in the male? Spermatogenesis, right? So FSH causes spermatogenesis in the male. And we're going to look at testosterone today and talk about testosterone's effect on spermatogenesis. It's a little bit different, so don't confuse those two. So we left off talking about FSH. We talked a little bit about LH. LH, of course, we said it's going to initiate ovulation. It's going to cause luteinization. We talked about the fact that LH affects the Leydig cells, cause production of testosterone. Questions on this slide we talked about last time. This is the process of luteinization. I like to ask questions on a test. I like to ask questions on a test about everything, but I like this one, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on here. What's that top left tell me? What is the top left? Okay, but what does it tell me if I look deeper at the cellular level there? What does it tell me that is starting and why? Okay, so that is the very early stages of ovulation because the basement membrane separating the granulosa cells and the theca interna cells are starting to degrade. That's allowing mixing of those two cells. Cell groups. We need granulosa cells and theca interna cells to mix before we luteinize them. Now that bottom left, we've jumped. What has changed between top left and bottom left? What's changed? What's dramatically changed? The ovum's gone. So ovulation took place, the follicular membrane broke. What is that thing on the very end at the bottom left, that red thing? Corpus hemorrhagicum, that was that blood spot we talked about. Behind that CH is that mixing of granulosa cells and luteal cells, or granulosa cells and theca interna cells. They're mixing at that point, the basement membrane's gone. LH is now going to come in there, so LH is going to have a direct effect at this point, right there, to luteinize those cell groups. Granulosa cells becoming large luteal cells, you can see LLC, and then theca interna becoming small luteal cells there. And those two cell groups do exactly the same thing. They produce progesterone, which I'm assuming you probably know that. And that's a CL there. And we'll take a look at CLs a little bit later on in the semester. Hopefully we can do a little bit of that. Okay. We talked about that. Hopefully we won't have to go back through those again. Okay. We left off here, I believe, last time. We talked about estrogen. We talked about it produced in response to FSH in that growing follicle and those granulosa cells. What about the male? I never want to forget the male in certain situations or the female in others. Why do we need to talk about the male in estrogen? It doesn't affect the male, right? Wrong. Why is estrogen important in the male? Sexual behavior. You've got to have a certain level of estrogen in the male to achieve normal sexual behavior. If you don't have enough, you have issues. If you have too much, you also have issues. Okay. What produces? Is it on there? What produces estrogen in the male? What produces it? Sertoli cells. Okay. Sertoli cells do a lot, obviously. Okay. We talked a lot about this already. Oh, let's go back to this one. What did we say this was all about here? The fact that estrogen causes a slight now. That's slight. Don't overstate those. Increase in uterine mass and increase in contractility of the uterus. What was that all about?
Help the movement from the sperm to be fertilized.
Okay, it's movement of the sperm. So, because we're talking about sexual receptivity, estrogen levels high, probably copulation taking place. So, what about the uterine mass thing?
Preparing it for conception.
Early preparation for potential implantation, right? It's all just early prep. Okay, good. Talk about secondary sex characteristics, talk about calcium, we talked about all that. We left off there. Again, what did we say about the mammary gland ducts? Not quite. Do you see T? Mammary glands have a duct system, little tubes. What do we say about it? Estrogen is responsible for development and maintenance of the ducts. Development and maintenance of the ducts. And we're going to make a comparison in just a second. Progesterone, this is we haven't talked about. Progesterone, as its name implies, progestation. You probably already know this. When we talk about an animal that is pregnant, a female that is pregnant, what is her progesterone levels? High. Progesterone levels must, I repeat, must remain high during pregnancy. What would happen if progesterone levels dropped? It will cause an abortion, right? If we drop, can we do that in animals? Can we artificially cause progesterone levels to drop? Now, we can give them drugs. We do that. We hope we're not. We hope we know more about our animals than this, but if we don't know anything about our animals, we give them a product, and there's more than just one, but a product called Lutelyse, which is a hormone we're fixing to talk about, that causes luteolysis. What is luteolysis? Luteolyse, kill. Killing the CL. Well, what makes progesterone? At least principally, the CL. If we kill the CL, what happens to progesterone levels? They drop. So if you give a cow or heifer that's pregnant a shot of Lutelyse and you don't know she's pregnant, what's going to happen? She's going to abort. We use Lutelyse for estrus synchronization, but sometimes if you don't know what you're doing and give it to the pregnant animal, it'll abort. So progesterone primarily is produced by CL in almost every species. Now, some species, the placenta itself will take over a lot of that production, but most of our species we deal with, the primary structure that produces progesterone throughout pregnancy is the CL. What do we know progesterone is all about? I'll show you a diagram in a second that kind of summarizes all this. The big part of what progesterone does is prepare the uterus for implantation. It does the heavy lifting. Estrogen just starts it. But progesterone does the heavy lifting of preparing that uterus for implantation. What does that mean? How do we need to prepare the uterus? What's going to happen to the uterus relative to increasing levels of progesterone? To make it ready for implantation. Okay, it thickens. Now there's a lot to that thickening part. It gets thicker. When it gets thicker, what does that create? A lot more area to house blood vessels. Why do we need more blood vessels? Yeah, because we're going to create a placenta there. We need to exchange nutrients and waste. We also see the development of more mucus-producing glands that make the uterus, the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, sticky. Okay, it makes it easier for implantation. I'll show you a diagram in a second to kind of summarize. We'll get into a little bit more of that. Now, we talked about estrogen effect on the mammary ducts. Progesterone has an effect on development and maintenance of the mammary alveoli. Let me draw this. I know we haven't got to lactational physiology yet, but just in case you don't know this, if you're in dairy production, hopefully she'll cover this if she hasn't already. If I go to microanatomy of the mammary gland, what's my basic functional unit of the mammary gland? The basic function, back to what we talked about. Where the milk is made, covered by those myoepithelial cells. What do we call it? An alveoli, or an alveolus for one. So it's going to look something like that, like a little round ball with a duct coming out of it. The milk is made in here, and the myoepithelial cells are on the outside affected by oxytocin. So that's an alveoli or alveolus. There's thousands and thousands of those. There's a duct. This, don't confuse this now, because you got three hormones playing together here. You got what hormones affecting inside here? Making milk. Prolactin. What hormones affecting the gland outside? Oxytocin. Progesterone allows these to develop in young animals and also allows the tissue to be maintained, the alveoli. Progesterone has nothing to do with milk letdown or nothing to do with milk production, so don't confuse that. Progesterone only has to do relative to the development and the maintenance of the alveoli tissue of the mammary gland. Now, this one is something that you should automatically, almost common sense, I think, know. Why? Let me go back. Progestation. Never mind. Why does progesterone have such a negative, very, very strong, one of the strongest negative feedbacks you will see on the hypothalamus? Why? Pregnancy, gestation, inhibits GnRH. Why?
We don't want to produce another follicle if you're pregnant.
You want to totally silence everything during pregnancy. You don't want cyclicity during pregnancy. So anytime progesterone levels are high, you're going to have an extremely strong negative feedback on the hypothalamus. It shuts off everything. No more cyclicity as long as progesterone levels are high. That's going to be important when we talk about what happens at the uterine level. So let's look at a diagram on your book. It summarizes all this. Now, if you can't see this, you've got to print it out. Let me turn the lights down a little bit so we see that better. Okay, let's define a few things. What's this yellow thing? It's a CO, okay. What's this? Okay, what's this? Pituitary gland, okay. What's that? Maybe just drew on the board. It's an alveolus, right? With the ducts there, not the ducts important. Now, this is what I want to spend the most amount of time on. What is this? It's a cuboidal cross-section of what? The uterus. Okay, it's a cross-section of the uterus. Now, also let's define what these little signs mean. Notice you've got little plus signs. What does that mean?
Positive feedback.
So, either positive feedback or stimulatory. Okay. What's the little negative signs with a circle around it? Negative feedback or inhibitory. So let's look at these one by one. We already talked about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Effect on the development and maintenance of the mammary alveoli. We mentioned that. Now, let's go over here for a second. What is this telling? Forget that line right there for a second. What's that line right there telling me? Okay. That's that negative feedback from high levels of progesterone on the hypothalamus. What is this? And why? This goes back to what I said. This is one of the strongest negative feedback mechanisms you'll find. We said this is a negative feedback on the hypothalamus, pretty obvious, right? What is this? It's a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary gland. Why do we need that? This animal is doing everything they can to prevent any possibility of cyclicity. What do they do? What is that? That's a backup. That's just backup. So the progesterone, we often talk about progesterone having a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. So that's true. But it also has a direct negative feedback on the anterior pituitary gland just in case. Just in case. That's a backup, just to make sure there is zero cyclicity. No FSH produced, no LH produced when progesterone levels are high. So that's all the negative feedback stuff. Here's positive. Notice positive, positive, no. Positive, positive, negative. Interesting. So positive, this is a cross-section of the uterus, so we got a lot of positive effects there. We got some negative stuff going on there, so wonder what that's about. So this is a cross-section of the uterus. Notice it is thickening. That allows for more blood flow, which is pretty obvious. This is where we're going to implant. You also see the development of these glands that cause more mucus production to make it stickier, or at least the endometrium, this outside layer here. This is actually the inside of the uterus right here. Makes it stickier for that embryo or embryos to actually implant. That's pretty obvious what that's all about. What is this all about down here, though? First of all, what is this? Okay, that is the myometrium. Myometrium is composed of two different muscle layers. Now, this is not just common to the uterus. It's the same thing you find in your gut. It's the same thing you find in your ureters, your urethra. It doesn't matter. Anywhere where we have smooth muscle, we're going to have two different layers of muscle. You have a circular muscle and a longitudinal muscle, layers of smooth muscle. You'll notice this is a circular layer here, and this is the longitudinal muscle layer here. What does that mean? That means these muscle fibers right here are headed towards you, straight towards you, boom. Whereas the circular muscle fibers up here are going in a circle around that tube. What does that create? What do we call that wave-like contraction? Because it requires squeeze, push, squeeze, push.
Yeah, peristalsis.
Peristalsis. We talk about that in the gut, right, or the digestive tract a lot. We also see it other places too. Why would we contract the uterus? Why do we ever need to contract the uterus? Yeah, parturition or during estrus. What's going to have a direct effect on those smooth muscle layers during birth? Or let me rephrase that. What hormone is going to have the strongest, I realize we haven't got there yet, what hormone is going to have the strongest effect during parturition on that smooth muscle layer?
Oxytocin.
Now, there's others that have an effect, but oxytocin is the strongest, right? Smooth muscle. We talked about estrogen's effect on the contractility of the uterus. It has a mild effect on this as well. But all that's positive. It's causing it to contract. What's happening here? It's making sure it doesn't contract. That's my favorite word. Make sure to write it down. I'm not going to tell you how to spell it. Look it up. It causes uterine quiescence. I love that word. When I say quiescence, what do you think of? It's like everybody needs to be quiet. We have quiescence in our room, right? Everything's quiet, still. We're not moving. It's uterine quiescence. Progesterone has a negative effect on the myometrium. The myometrium is the muscle layer of the uterus. Why do we not want contractility during pregnancy?
It's embedded.
Right. Because if you have contraction during pregnancy, it's going to disturb the implanted embryo. That would be problematic. Now, of course, late pregnancy, as we move into parturition, this block goes away because the CL starts to shrink up, and then oxytocin can have an effect on this. Does that make sense? So, progesterone has a strong negative effect on the myometrial layer, the myometrium of the uterus, but has a very positive effect on the endometrium layer, which is the kind of the top layer of the uterus. So don't confuse those two. Progesterone has a negative, strong effect on the myometrial layer to prevent it from contracting, but a positive effect on the endometrial layer. Causes it to thicken, increased vasculature, increased glandular production, all that. Does that, questions at all on that? That's a summary of what progesterone does in the female. What about the, I shouldn't ask this may bring up bad memories. What about the male?
Doesn't produce it.
Yeah, some of y'all didn't get that quite right on the exam. There was a few tricky questions on the exam. I know that shocked you. Okay. Now let's add on to this a few hormones that are, I would say, of a little bit lesser importance, or at least important from just a point in time. One of them, and this is now, we're on the ovarian level, so we're talking about the female here. We will mention the males as we go through. Inhibin. If you don't know, and I know those on your list, but if you didn't know anything about anything, and I said inhibin, what would you automatically think of? Something is being inhibited. Something is being inhibited. Inhibin is key to understanding this dynamic right here that we talked about, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. But inhibin is produced by the granulosome female, in the male produced by the Sertoli cell. We'll talk about what it does in the male in just a second. Understand, it inhibits FSH, but doesn't inhibit LH. Let me say that again. It inhibits FSH, but it doesn't inhibit LH. So just saying that, what's the target of inhibin? Anterior pituitary gland. Why not the hypothalamus?
It doesn't affect LH.
Right. So if we were to inhibit the hypothalamus, it would inhibit GnR. It would inhibit GnRH, which would also inhibit obviously FSH and LH. We don't want that. So we go to the source of FSH and LH. So inhibin is going to cause an inhibition of FSH without affecting LH. When do we need, when do we need to shut off FSH but allow LH to keep going? And that's when inhibin comes into play. When do we need to shut off FSH? When the follicle reaches maturity. So right here I said what happens to FSH? It drops off, but LH keeps going. Inhibin comes to play right there. So it's a point in time enzyme. Point in time hormone. It's not like we're going to talk about with estrogen and all that. It's a point in time. But it inhibits FSH without affecting LH. So we're going to see inhibin come to play around the time of ovulation or just before ovulation to allow LH to keep going to the cervix. In the male, what do you think it does in the male? Well, I don't know. We don't know what it does for sure in the male. But if it's affecting FSH in the male, what do you think it's doing? You got to make all this stepwise backwards. If we are affecting FSH in the male, what are we affecting? Spermatogenesis, because FSH causes spermatogenesis. So if we are kind of toying around with FSH levels by way of inhibin, we're probably having to do something with spermatogenesis. The thought is, there's no clear answer with inhibin in the male. The thought is it regulates spermatogenesis. It's just more regulatory relative to sperm production. But that's the thought more than proof. I'll come at that in a second. Relaxin, again, another one. If I just said the word relaxin, what do you think of? Relaxing, and that's true to an extent. Relaxin is going to be in play particularly during late pregnancy and during parturition. Why during late pregnancy and parturition? What is happening from a tissue level standpoint during late pregnancy and parturition? Things are moving and things are getting softer. Why? Because you got a bunch of baby in there and that baby's ready to get out eventually, and you got to have tissue that's soft so the baby can get through there. That's the bottom line. So what tissue specifically do we see affecting in the female, of course? Relaxin's effect. It does soften the cervix. Why do we want to soften? During pregnancy, I know we haven't done anatomy, but during pregnancy, describe the cervix for me. During pregnancy, describe the cervix for me.
Rigid.
Tight. Why? Full of a mucus plug. Why?
Protection.
It's like that last door to protect the baby. Well, guess what? When the baby's ready to get out, if that door's still shut tight, baby ain't getting out. So relaxin is going to soften the cervix so the baby can start pushing through that cervix. Okay? So that's one effect. Now, even before that, though, we have an effect on pelvic ligaments. Now, I realize we haven't looked at this anatomically as well, but if we know the uterus, we've got the hips, right? Saying I'm standing behind a cow. Hips here, and I've got, if I go inside this cow, her head's that direction, I'm standing at her butt. Where's her reproductive tract? Right inside there, and her horns or uterus are kind of hanging over that hip bone, the backside of the hip. One of those horns is going to be full of a baby, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to drop into the body cavity. What is holding up those uterine horns? It's called the broad ligament, and it's holding it up to the uterus. To the pelvic bone. Well, guess what? If those didn't stretch, what happened? It obviously ripped. So relaxin allows that pelvic ligaments to stretch. So as gestation proceeds, that baby, especially in the case of a single bear, can drop down into the body cavity without actually rupturing the tissue. And then, of course, the uterus itself needs to be softened because it's getting bigger, right? Whether it's a litter bear or not, the uterus is going to get bigger. If the uterus was not allowed to stretch, obviously it would rupture as well. Okay? So relaxin is all about softening tissue, allows things to stretch. So inhibin, relaxin, again, these are kind of point in time. Relaxin is going to come to play primarily late pregnancy and during parturition. Now these two are not outliers, but they are ones you don't normally think of relative to where they're produced and what they do. We've talked about oxytocin being produced by primarily the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. We also have oxytocin produced by the CL in small amounts. Why? Think about what oxytocin does. Causes milk letdown, right? When is the CL going to be kind of in play, and particularly when we might need some milk letdown in small amounts? What causes milk letdown? I know oxytocin, but what causes oxytocin to be produced? Anybody that's ever been around females before? Female pregnant animals. Females. If you ever milk at the dairy, they don't just come in and say, "Oh, hi." You've got to have some sort of tactile stimulation from, ideally, right, in nature, ideally from the offspring, the baby, touching the teats or touching the udder, stimulating that. And tactile stimulation causes, we'll go through this, causes a signal and stimulates this production of oxytocin called milk letdown. Okay, y'all know that, right? That makes sense. All animals do it. Well, not birds, but all mammals. Why would we need, though, some oxytocin produced by the CL? In other words, think about the animal's life. When would a baby need milk when it doesn't have the ability to tactily stimulate? Put it that way. That wasn't a very good question. What happens right at parturition? Do we need milk for the baby? Do we need milk in the teats ready for the baby as soon as it hits the ground? Yes. Is that baby going to know to automatically start tactically stimulating? No, it's going to be too weak. So this oxytocin produced by the CL is very early milk letdown, so there is milk in the teats at birth. If you've ever been around, and not just in livestock species, a number of animals will do this. Right at parturition or right before parturition, you can oftentimes see milk dripping from the teats. You're like, well, where's that come from? There's no tactile stimulation. It's from that. It allows there to be some milk. So you got a baby, it's a weak baby, it's like, oh, there's stuff dripping from that faucet up there. Let me try that out. And what happens? They try it out, and then they have now tactically stimulated that mammary gland, and so now you get the entire cycle for oxytocin. Does that make sense? So that CL production of oxytocin is very low level milk letdown to have milk in the teats at birth, so the baby can find the nutrients. This we've already mentioned. The theca interna cells of a follicle produces testosterone. Why do we have testosterone production in the female? Because we also, just like the male, we need a certain level of testosterone in the female for normal sexual behavior. Yes, ma'am?
With the milk letdown, like how early are we talking for it to I know like in I had a friend who was pregnant and she started experiencing like milk coming out like at a couple of months.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about humans, but most of the time in animals, you're talking about maybe a couple of days as a general rule. You're not talking about months. That would probably be a little bit abnormal when it comes to animals. But I don't want to jump into the human world because I don't know anything about humans, so I try to avoid humans. No, I shouldn't say that. We love humans, right? We love humans sometimes. So, what if a female has no testosterone? Because that's no big deal. It's a big deal. What if she has too much testosterone? Yeah, she's masculine, or vice versa. If a male has too much estrogen, then they're feminine. And so, is that a problem reproductively? It can be if the levels are too high. So there has to be an appropriate level. Obviously, in the females will have a lot more estrogen than testosterone. And vice versa, the male can have a lot more testosterone than estrogen. But it is all about balancing for normal sexual behavior in the two sexes. Anybody, questions on any of that? Inhibin, relaxin, what that oxytocin is coming from the CL? Okay. I would say I'm sorry for the ball fans in here, but I'm not. I was actually at that football game. That was 2004. Fun times. I remember that. That's Eric Ainge. He was, hit Eric Ainge on the radio somewhere in Tennessee these days, running his mouth or something. Anyway, that was a fun time. Testosterone. Testosterone produced obviously by the testes. We talked about that already, specifically from the Leydig cells. Now here's where we got to be careful with testosterone. Back up. What hormone causes spermatogenesis? You're caught up in this whole cause and knows what hormone causes spermatogenesis? FSH. But you must have testosterone present for normal spermatogenesis. If you have FSH and no testosterone, are you going to have spermatogenesis? No. You've got to have testosterone present. It's not causing it, but you have to have it present. It has to kind of encompass, if you will, the whole process of spermatogenesis for it to be normal. Now, the epididymis, which we really haven't talked about very much, I'm going to go ahead and write this on the board now. This is it is considered an accessory sex organ. The epididymis is a structure that connects more or less, my drawing will not be good, connects more or less a testis. I'm just going with the generic circle for testis. I apologize, it's different by species. But it connects. So if I got this testis here and I got what's this tube called? That's transporting sperm cells. The vas deferens or the ductus deferens. The epididymis, it does not look like this because I can't draw, but it is this intermediary structure connecting the testis proper to the vas deferens. The epididymis has 4 functions. One is pretty obvious, is transportation. And we'll get more into this. So it transports sperm cells. It also is involved in maturation of sperm cells, concentration, and also storage, particularly the tail of the epididymis. We tend to store a lot of sperm cells in the tail of the epididymis. Again, we'll come back to this later on when we do some anatomy stuff, but that is the epididymis and that is its functions. Relative to the mammal, birds are quite different when it comes to epididymis. Testosterone is involved in functioning of the epididymis. It's also involved in functioning of the other accessory sex organs. Give me some examples of accessory sex organs. Again, we'll look at this with anatomy. This is one. What's some other? Testes are not accessory sex organs. That's the primary sex organ. What are accessories? It's these things that you need to deliver. Okay? Remember, we're delivering semen, not sperm cells, so we got to have seminal plasma. So things like prostate gland, you probably can't read that, but urethral gland, testicular glands. Okay. What about the penis? That's an accessory sex organ. What about the scrotum? That's accessory sex organ too. Okay. Those are all accessories. Those are delivery mechanisms, making semen, maintaining temperature, regulating temperature of the testes in the case of the scrotum. Yes, ma'am.
What's that second word?
You can't read that?
No.
I can't read it either. It's bulbourethral gland. Don't worry too much about it. We'll come back to this. The bulbourethral glands. Bulbourethral glands. It's one of the accessory sex glands. Prostate, bulbourethral glands, vesicular glands. Those are the ones that make that seminal plasma that are combined with semen, or with sperm cells. Don't worry too much about that, though. We'll look at that. Obviously, talk about sexual behavior. Secondary sex characteristics. What makes a boy look like a boy? Testosterone does. Give me some examples of that.
Beard.
You say beard?
Yeah.
Well, that is true. Okay, what else? I mean, not just in humans, yeah, but what other animals too?
More angular features.
Okay.
Like a vein.
Muscle.
Okay. Muscle accretion. What else?
Typically bigger. Bigger.
Bigger frame size. What about birds?
Colorful.
Colorful.
Comb water, color. All that's testosterone control. So the secondary sex characteristics of that sexual dimorphism. Anabolic activity. What do I mean by that?
Growth.
Growth, particularly muscle accretion. Okay, we talked about testosterone's effect on muscle accretion. Now this one I want to spend a second on. Testosterone has a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Question is why? Okay, so let's generalize for just a second. We're generalizing, so don't get too caught up in it. If I'm generalizing estrogen in a female, levels, what's it going to look like within the estrous cycle? We're generalizing right now. What's it going to look like?
Very high.
Like that, right? Okay. That's normal. What, in the case of the male, assuming normal physiology, what is it going to look like in the male relative to testosterone? Normally.
Just a flat line.
We hope it looks like that. Why? Why do we hope it looks like that? Because if it looks like this, then that's a problem, because that right there is when you die. Seriously. And if testosterone levels were able to ever get that high, a male would kill themselves. They would just literally kill themselves because of the aggression thing. So testosterone is very steady state. It should be steady state. Now, does it fluctuate at all? It can, but it's not dramatic. Now, if I look, though, that looks straight line from where you're sitting. But if I came up here and looked at this up close, it would look more like that. What is that? Up and down, 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 up and down. It's up and down levels, but very low level changes. What prevents testosterone from continuing to rise? It's its effect on the hypothalamus. Once testosterone, let me zoom in here first. I'm zooming in. Once testosterone starts to go up, what happens? It has a negative feedback on the hypothalamus. LH levels go down. Well, GnRH levels go down. LH levels go down. The Leydig cells don't produce as much testosterone. What happens to testosterone? Testosterone levels. They go down. Once that negative feedback now is gone, what happens? It goes back up. GnRH levels go back up. LH levels back up. So, get it? Back. So that's what it looks like in the male when we blow it up. Okay. Does that make sense? That's the key to the male. That's extremely important in survivability of the male. The fact that testosterone does have a negative feedback on the hypothalamus to keep testosterone levels within a very short window or short range of changing levels. That's important for survival of that. Okay. Questions at all on that? Okay. Now these are somewhat secondary in the male, and again, some of these you don't understand. By the way, I should ask this question as a trivia question. None of you were, no, some of you were probably alive. Maybe. How many of you were born before, you don't have to tell me your age, before 1990? Oh, God. Okay, Don, when were you born, Don? 1986. Well, you still weren't alive. I was. Okay. What is this famous play? Anybody know? Who over the top? Have you ever heard of Bo Jackson? Okay, some of you are like, I know. That's Bo Jackson right there, the greatest player ever to play this athletic experience, greatest ever, right? I mean, no, that was voted. ESPN voted that. It's great. He played baseball. He played baseball and he played football. And all. Bo's great. Okay, that's Bo over the top. That was a famous play against, of course, that awful school in that trash hole of the city. Okay, anyway, so inhibin, we talked about inhibin. Inhibin does what in the female now? Inhibits FSH without what? Inhibiting LH. Again, we think in the male that it regulates spermatogenesis because it also inhibits FSH, and FSH is controlling spermatogenesis. So the thought is inhibin regulates spermatogenesis in the male. And again, estrogen, we've already mentioned this several times, estrogen produced post-Sertoli cell in the male to have that certain level of estrogen for normal sexual behavior in the male. These are somewhat secondary, but I wanted to mention those anyway. Now this, I don't expect you to memorize these structures at all, but I do want you to recognize the similarities here and know that there's a common quote-unquote ancestor, if you will, for all three of them. What are these what's the biochemical classification of these three enzymes, of these three hormones? They're steroids. So we've got progesterone, testosterone, estrogen. Why these arrows here? Why do we have arrows? No, not necessarily, but what the arrows mean is that we can easily convert between these hormones because they're very similar in structure. You see those heterocyclic rings there. All steroid hormones are derivative of something you certainly have heard of and you eat probably, is cholesterol. This is one reason why you do need certain amounts of cholesterol. Of course, if you don't eat cholesterol, your body will make it anyway to be able to manufacture steroid hormones. But you can see that all of these are derived from cholesterol. My point with this, though, is showing you, because we will come back to some of this, we'll oftentimes see, especially testosterone and estrogen, they will flip back and forth. They will aromatize, is what it's called, the enzyme conversion between the two. If in the case of a male, if the male needs more estrogen, what happens? He takes some testosterone and converts it to estrogen, and vice versa. So it's fairly easy to convert between these steroid hormones. You can see that they're very similar in structure. That's all. I don't want you to memorize that. I do want you to know cholesterol is a derivative for all three of the steroid hormones. Okay, last hormone. Yay, last hormone. Prostaglandin. Now, a lot of y'all missed this on the test. You got points taken off because of why? You just said prostaglandin. There are more than one type of prostaglandin. The most common is F2 alpha, which is the one we'll most commonly talk about. There is another one which we will talk about when we talk about parturition called E2. PGF2 alpha, though, is the primary prostaglandin we talk about. This is unique because this is the only one we'll talk about that is a fatty acid in structure. This is produced by the uterus. So let's think about this. The uterus producing a hormone, and that hormone has a strong, here's a word. What's that mean? Luteolysis or luteolytic effect. Regression of the CL. So the PGF2 alpha is produced by the uterus to cause CL regression. Why would this need to happen? Or when does this happen? After a pregnancy is over, baby's gone, placenta's gone, we need a signal. It says uterus is literally saying, I'm empty, by way of PGF2 alpha. And what does that mean? It's saying I'm empty because it's producing PGF2 alpha. That PGF2 alpha is causing regression of the CL. What happens to progesterone levels if we regress the CL? They go down. What is removed from the hypothalamus? That strong negative feedback causing what to initiate again? Cyclicity, GnH production, all that stuff, okay? So PGF2 alpha is a signal from the uterus that the pregnancy's over, causing CL regression. Progesterone levels go down. If progesterone levels go down, the negative block on the hypothalamus goes away, allowing the hypothalamus to produce GnRH and cyclicity to start back. When else would we see this? Somewhat related to that. A signal that, hint, a signal that there is nothing in the uterus.
The end of estrous cycle?
Right. If we have no pregnancy actually take place, if we ovulate and there is no fertilization taking place, we still develop, when we ovulate, we still develop a CL. And that ovum makes its way along, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, where's the boys? No boys. Well, hey, boys, where's the boys? No boys. But it keeps going. It doesn't have time to wait. It keeps going, and eventually it's gone. But there's still a CL sitting there. So what needs to say no pregnancy ever took place here? The uterus does. And so the uterus is going to signal that PGF2 alpha signal back to the CL, causing regression, cause cyclicity to start over again. Does that make sense? So PGF2 alpha not only is in play after a pregnancy, it's also at play at the end of the estrous cycle if no fertilization actually took place, to signal that there was no implantation in the uterus. We can start over again. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So PGF2 alpha. Again, E2 is less common version. That is specifically what we'll talk about during parturition. Okay. And we'll also talk about PGF2 alpha. This is more related to parturition as well. PGF2 alpha will come back into play a little bit itself during parturition to affect contractility of the uterus, but very mild. Anytime we see estrogen or PGF2 alpha's effect on the uterus contractility, it's a very, very mild effect, whereas oxytocin is very aggressive. It's effect on the smooth muscle. All right. Questions on any hormones at all? Anything we need to go back through? Yes, ma'am. You missed 1 point off. Take 1 point off. You didn't put F2 alpha.
Isn't E2 estrogen?
No, E2, yeah, it's a little... Good question. E2 by itself is estrogen.
Oh, okay, so it's okay.
PG, I know it's PGE2 is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good. Thank you for asking. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, don't confuse that. That's PGE2. Anything else? Any other hormone? Any questions?
Does the testosterone level in the female stay consistent, or will it decrease during pregnancy at all, or will it kind of stay?
For the most part, it stays consistent. The level is, I don't want to overstate it. The level is low.
Yeah.
I mean, it's low.
Mhm.
But it's got to be there some. It stays fairly steady.
Okay.
So you said E3 by itself is estrogen. What is the difference between estradiol and estrogen?
And nothing. For my purposes, nothing. If you put estradiol on the test, or estrogen, we interchange those all the time. Estradiol is technically the biochemical name for the substance, basically. But those are interchangeable. Yeah.
So I know it's like equal, but in like for testosterone, some guys take steroids to like maybe get bigger. Is it like is it just the amount that they put in that to go up higher, or is it like have the hypothalamus not make it, I guess, cut off at an earlier stage?
Yeah, that's a good question. She asked what actually happens when males take exogenous testosterone. When you do that, what happens? Now you can get an effect. You obviously get muscle accretion. We see the bodybuilders or all that stuff and the effects. But what happens is when you start to take exogenous testosterone, your body, I use that term loosely, your body, your hypothalamus, your testes, it thinks that you're getting way too much testosterone. So if your testes, the source, obviously Leydig cells is the source of testosterone, if it thinks that you've got plenty of testosterone, in fact you've got too much testosterone, the testes themselves will start to shrink up because they're not needed anymore, because your body's saying, I don't need you anymore because this other stuff's hanging out here, so why am I? So it starts to shrink up. And the effect on the hypothalamus is kind of similar too. You pretty much overload the hypothalamus, and it just more or less is, I don't want to say shuts down, but relative to its effect of LH, GnRH, LH from the anterior gland and the testes, that goes away because it's all based on the effect on the testes, because what the testes sense is that there's plenty of testosterone there. I'm actually going to start shrinking up. I'm not needed anymore. So the fact that LH is being produced, the testes, I'm not saying the testes are dead, but they've shrunken up so much that the LH is not having an effect on them to cause them to manufacture more testosterone. Your body literally is thinking that you've got homeostatic, even beyond homeostatic levels of testosterone when you take exogenous testosterone because of that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so when they stop taking